On the morning of the 19th of December, 1944, two American infantry regiments sat surrounded in the Ardennes Forest, with no ammunition resupply, no artillery support, no relief column coming, and German soldiers closing the ring from every direction. Their commanders made the only calculation the arithmetic would allow: destroy the weapons, smash the radios, burn the codebooks, and put your hands up. Approximately 7,000 to 8,000 American soldiers surrendered that afternoon, making it the largest mass surrender of American troops since Bataan 3 years earlier. But not every man put his hands up. Somewhere between 70 and 150 soldiers looked at the same situation, made a different read of it, and turned west into the trees, with no weapon, no map beyond what memory could hold. Snow coming down through the pines, German columns on every road, and somewhere between 30 and 50 miles of occupied territory between them and anything that might be called safety. One of them was a soldier named Joseph Hoerth. He was not famous. His name does not appear in the major histories of the Battle of the Bulge, and he did not receive a Medal of Honor. He was a young man from the 106th Infantry Division who, through a specific combination of judgment, persistence, and decisions that held up under conditions designed to break them, walked home. To understand what that walk meant, you have to understand what the 106th Infantry Division walked into when it reached the Ardennes in December 1944. Because what happened to that division was not misfortune in the ordinary sense. It was a predictable outcome of decisions made far above the men who paid for them. The 106th Infantry Division formed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in March 1943. And over the next 20 months, it trained at camps across the American South. Running through the full cycle of infantry instruction the Army had systematized by that point, covering rifle marksmanship, field fortification, tactical movement, map reading, and the mechanics of coordinated fire and maneuver at the squad, platoon, and company level. What the training could not include was the one thing that actually differentiates soldiers who have been in combat from soldiers who haven't the experience of being shot at. The fear that rewires every calculation, the instinct for where cover actually is rather than where the manual says it should be, and the specific, unrepeatable knowledge of how a situation feels when it is going wrong fast. The 106th arrived in England in October 1944, without any of that. Its average enlisted man was around 20 years old, and most of its junior officers had never commanded men under fire. The division crossed to the continent and was assigned to the 8th Corps, commanded by Major General Troy Middleton, and on December 10, 1,944 days before the German offensive began, it took over a sector of the front from the veteran 2nd Infantry Division near the Schnee Eifel, a forested ridge running along the German-Belgian border. The sector was 21 miles wide. Standard doctrine held that an infantry division in a prepared defensive position could hold 4 to 6 miles of front with adequate depth and flexibility, but the 106th was handed 21. The 2nd Division had managed that same sector through aggressive patrolling, local intelligence built over weeks in place, and a detailed understanding of every trail, village, and German observation post in the area. The 106th inherited the ground, but not the accumulated knowledge, and they had been there 6 days when the German artillery opened up at 5:30 inches the morning on the 16th of December, 1944. What began that morning was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. Adolf Hitler had been planning it since September, an assault through the Ardennes aimed at splitting the Allied armies, seizing the port of Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated settlement before the inevitable end arrived. The operation, called Watch on the Rhine, used 200,000 troops, approximately 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,000 900 artillery pieces assembled in complete secrecy through 6 weeks of night movement and radio silence. The Ardennes was chosen precisely because it was considered quiet. SHAEF and First Army Intelligence had assessed the sector as unsuitable for major offensive operations, concluding the terrain was too difficult, the road network too limited, and the weather too uncertain. These assessments were not merely wrong, they were actively maintained against contrary evidence. In the weeks before December 16, 8 Corps intelligence had documented increased German radio traffic. Aerial reconnaissance had identified vehicle columns moving at night, and forward outposts along the Our River had reported sounds of tank engines across the line. But each report traveled up the chain of command and was rationalized into the prevailing assessment of defensive activity, nothing to concern the high command. 3 German armies hit the Ardennes front simultaneously. The 6th SS Panzer Army under SS General Joseph Dietrich on the northern shoulder, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel in the center, and the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger on the southern shoulder. Against the 106th Infantry Division specifically, General Major Gunther Hoffmann Schönborn's 18th Volksgrenadier Division executed a double envelopment, pushing one regiment east of the Schnee Eifel Ridge and another west, bypassing the American positions rather than attacking them frontally. By the evening of December 17, 36 hours into the offensive, both bypass columns had linked up behind the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, the road through Blealf. Their supply route east was cut, and the road through Schönberg, their only avenue west, was under German control, leaving the 2 regiments together with attached artillery and support units completely encircled. What followed was 3 days of deteriorating communications, dwindling ammunition, and increasingly desperate requests for relief that could not be filled fast enough. The 7th Armored Division was fighting its way toward St. Vith, 8 miles west, but the road there ran through German-held Schönberg. Air resupply was impossible because the overcast that had hidden the German buildup for weeks was still solid. Artillery ammunition was rationed and then exhausted, and small arms ammunition ran critically low. Colonel George Deschenaux, commanding the 422nd Infantry, was 28 years old when he called his officers together on the afternoon of December 19. He was a professional soldier who understood what his mission required, and he had done his job, held his position for 3 days against a force that outnumbered him, outgunned him, and had positioned itself to kill every man he commanded if they kept fighting with what they had left. He told his officers that he would not sacrifice his men to no military purpose, and at 4 p.m. he ordered the 422nd to destroy its weapons and surrender. Colonel Charles Cavender reached the same conclusion with the 423rd 2 hours later. The men smashed their rifle stocks against trees, bent the barrels of machine guns, pulled the bolts from artillery pieces and threw them into the snow, and burned the code books before raising their hands. The 106th Infantry Division lost more men captured in those 3 days than any other American division in the European theater of operations, and it remains, by most reckonings, the worst single defeat the United States Army suffered in the entire Ardennes campaign. But in the tree line, away from the columns forming up to march east, a smaller number of men heard the order and kept moving in the other direction. Joseph Hoerth was among them. The exact unit designation he served in within the 106th is not recorded in every source, but what is documented is the choice he made on December 19, and what followed from it. He went west instead of east, with his compass, his uniform, and his field jacket, but no weapon, because the weapons had been destroyed. The men who walked west in those first hours had one advantage over the men who surrendered. The German encirclement was not yet fully administered. The ring was drawn, but it was not everywhere solid, and there were gaps in the tree cover, stretches of high ground that German infantry hadn't yet occupied, and trails through the Schnee Eifel that moved northwest away from the main German positions. The men who knew the terrain, or could read what they remembered of it, found those gaps. They moved in small groups because a large formation would have left tracks too visible in the snow, made noise that carried in the frozen air, and drawn attention from German patrol vehicles using the logging roads. Small groups were quieter, harder to spot, and more flexible in a landscape that offered different options every few hundred yards. Lieutenant Ivan Long, leading the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 423rd Infantry, brought his men out through one of those gaps, traveling over 18 miles to reach American positions at St. Vith. A photograph exists of his platoon arriving, a line of men in field gear, haggard with frost on their helmets, alive. Other groups made it in ones and twos, and some did not make it at all. The number who attempted the walk and were caught or killed in the attempt has never been definitively established because there were no records kept of decisions made in the dark in the Ardennes Forest when the command structure had already gone east. What the records do show is this: of the approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men who were surrounded, between 70 and 150 reached American lines, which is roughly 1 man in 50, with the rest going into captivity. The Ardennes Forest in December is not the place it looks in photographs taken in better weather. The trees are dense conifers, spruce and fir, packed close enough that midday light comes through gray and flat, and the trails between them run narrow. With the snow on the ground in December 1944, sitting 2 to 3 inches deep in the open and deeper, where it had drifted against the base of the trees. Temperature averaged between 18 and 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Fog was the standard condition rather than the exception, and the cloud cover that had prevented Allied air operations since the offensive began also prevented navigation by stars, which meant a compass was the only reliable tool for a man trying to hold a direction through terrain where the trees looked identical in every direction. Frostbite and trench foot together produced more than 15,000 American casualties during the Battle of the Bulge, a number that does not appear on any list of men killed or wounded by the enemy, but that accounts for a meaningful fraction of the roughly 80,000 total American casualties the battle produced. For a man walking through the Ardennes without the ability to stop and warm his feet, the cold was not discomfort, it was a threat with a specific timeline, because feet go numb first, then the skin starts to break down, and men who stopped moving for too long in the wrong conditions stopped being able to walk. The German rear area through which any evader had to move was not a quiet place. The 5th Panzer Army was advancing at a pace that surprised even its own commanders in the first week, and supply columns were running on the same logging roads that a walking American would want to use. The main paved routes through towns like Prüm, Vianden, and Houffalize were jammed with truck traffic moving west, meaning any road useful to an escaping American was equally useful to a German supply sergeant, and the German supply sergeants were using all of them. And then there was Operation Greif Otto Skorzény's commando operation that inserted German soldiers wearing American uniforms and driving captured jeeps behind Allied lines, with instructions to sow confusion, cut communications, and spread disinformation about German movements. Operation Greif accomplished little militarily, but it produced a paranoia in the Allied rear that meant any American soldier arriving from the direction of the German lines was immediately suspected of being an agent. And men who had walked for days through the Ardennes to reach American positions were met at the perimeter with rifles and hard questions about baseball standings and state capitals and the name of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend. Getting to the American lines was only part of the problem, because getting through them was another matter entirely. Joseph Hoerth was captured at some point in the initial chaos, though the precise circumstances are not fully documented in the available record. The opening days of the Bulge produced a chaos in the Allied rear that swallowed individual stories, with men cut off on roads, surrounded in villages, and taken in farmyards. Hoerth ended up at Stalag 9B at Bad Orb, Germany. Bad Orb sits in the Spessart Hills of central Germany, about 50 miles east of Frankfurt, and Stalag 9B had been operating as a prisoner of war camp since 1939. By the winter of 1944 and 1945, it was severely overcrowded, designed to hold several hundred men, but receiving thousands from the Bulge, and it was short of food, short of fuel for heating, and short of medicine. American enlisted men at Bad Orb received rations that multiple survivors later described as inadequate to sustain a person through a German winter. The International Red Cross made inspections and filed reports, and packages from home arrived inconsistently when they arrived at all. Some prisoners received nothing from the Red Cross for months. The men lost weight quickly in a way that changed the shape of their faces within weeks, and men who had weighed 170 pounds at the Schnee Eifel were at 130 by February. Hoerth would eventually lose approximately 40 pounds during his captivity, and his feet, frostbitten during the walk in December, had not fully healed by the time spring arrived. The winter passed, and news filtered into the camp through oblique channels, German guards who were less careful than they should have been, civilian workers who sometimes passed a word, and fragments of BBC broadcasts picked up on contraband radio sets hidden in the camp barracks. What the news said by March was unmistakable. The Americans had crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7, and Patton's Third Army was moving fast through central Germany, with the front coming east, and the distance between Bad Orb and the American lines shrinking. That was the calculation Joseph Hoerth made in late March 1945. Not an emotional calculation, but a practical one. The Germans were losing the ability to administer their rear areas as the front collapsed toward them. The camps were understaffed as guards, who had been holding positions for months, were being pulled forward to fight. The roads were increasingly chaotic as German military units moved in both directions, and German civilians in the villages and farms of the Spessart region were making their own calculations about the near future and who they wanted to be seen helping when the Americans arrived. The moment for attempting escape, if it was ever going to come, was now. Hoerth went over the wire on the 28th of March, 1945, with 3 men he had been alongside since the Schnee Eifel, John Mason, Bruce Fisher, and a man named Edwards. They had spent months in the same barracks, eaten the same insufficient rations, shared whatever news filtered into the camp, and kept each other's thinking reasonably calibrated through a winter designed to erode a man's ability to think clearly. They had no weapons and no detailed maps, but they had a general knowledge of the direction they needed to travel west-southwest toward the advancing American lines, and a small supply of items accumulated in the days before the escape, specifically for trading, primarily the standard Red Cross soap that had come in packages that winter. In the countryside around Bad Orb in March 1945, American soap was worth more than German money to farm families who hadn't seen it in years, and that detail matters because it reveals something important about how Hoerth thought about the problem. 4 men with frostbitten feet and roughly 40 pounds of weight loss, each attempting to cross 35 to 40 miles of occupied Germany, found that one of their primary survival assets was soap, not weapons, not forged documents, but soap, because the war had reduced everything to its most basic elements of shelter, warmth, and food, and they had found the one commodity they possessed that could be exchanged for those things. They moved at night when possible, staying on the high ground through the forested Spessart hills and avoiding the valleys where the roads were and where German military traffic was running. During the day, they sheltered in barns, abandoned outbuildings, and the edge of the forest, resting and watching and listening to the sound of the roads below while assessing where to move next when dark came. When a farmhouse showed a light and a German civilian answered the door, the exchange was transactional and fast soap for bread, a tin of something for hard cheese. And enough farmers in the Spessart in March 1945 were pragmatic enough to complete the exchange and close the door without making it anyone else's problem. On Easter Sunday, the 1st of April 1945, the situation almost ended when a German soldier accounts describe him as disorganized, probably a straggler from some rear area unit caught in the general collapse, briefly took Hoerth and Mason into custody. The specific exchange that followed is not fully documented, but the records indicate the two men were not held for long because a German soldier in a collapsing rear area in the first days of April 1945, holding two unarmed and starving American prisoners with no transportation to move them and no unit to report them to, was in an untenable position of his own. Hoerth and Mason walked away. 2 days later, on the 3rd of April 1945, the four men walked into a town that American forces had liberated the night before. 6 days, 35 to 40 miles on damaged feet, on near-starvation rations, through terrain actively occupied by German military forces. Now it is worth pulling back from the individual story to look at what was happening around it. By the 3rd of April 1945, American forces had been across the Rhine for nearly 4 weeks, and Patton's Third Army had broken out of its bridgehead and was driving northeast and east through the heart of Germany at a pace that its own supply officers found difficult to keep up with. The Ruhr industrial region was being encircled by Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group from the north and General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group from the south, and by April 1, the Ruhr pocket contained approximately 300,000 German soldiers with no realistic prospect of relief. This is the context Hoerth was walking through, not a coherent military occupation, but the final days of a disintegrating one, where German military police units that had maintained order in the rear areas since 1942 were understaffed, overwhelmed, or simply gone, and the Volkssturm Home Guard, scraped together from teenage boys and men in their 50s and 60s, was manning checkpoints and roadblocks with varying degrees of commitment to the task. The advancing American front was producing a specific kind of chaos that actually aided escape and evasion. When a town changed hands overnight, the day after liberation was administratively blank, with the German administrative structure gone and the American one not yet established, and men arriving from the German side in those first hours were in ambiguous territory, not quite behind German lines anymore, but not yet processed by American military authority. Hoerth and his companions reached their liberation point during exactly this kind of window. They were not the only Americans who survived in this way. Across the European theater, approximately 16,000 Allied servicemen successfully evaded German capture and returned to friendly lines during the war. According to post-war records compiled by the Military Intelligence Service Escape and Evasion Section, MISX, the American organization that trained airmen in escape and evasion techniques and debriefed men who made it back. MISX was based at Fort Hunt, Virginia, operating under the cover address P.O. Box 1142, and was modeled closely on Britain's MI9. Most of MISX's documented successes involved airmen, downed pilots, and bombers crews who received formal evasion training before their missions, who carried silk escape maps sewn into their flight gear, and who parachuted into France or Belgium, where organized resistance networks maintained escape lines running south through Spain toward Gibraltar or east toward Switzerland. Those men had infrastructure, while Hoerth had soap and a compass. What the MIS-X record showed, when analysts looked at the cases that succeeded, was that the distinguishing factor was not physical toughness in the conventional sense. The men who made it were the ones who moved deliberately rather than desperately, who assessed the civilian environment rather than avoiding it entirely, who identified the specific moments when the risk calculation shifted in their favor and acted in those moments rather than waiting for certainty that never came. Hoerth waited for late March before going over the wire, when the German rear area was collapsing, but the American lines were close enough to reach on foot. He traveled with a small group rather than alone, which meant there were 4 sets of eyes and 4 sets of judgment checking each other's assessments. He traded for food rather than attempting to live off the land in a region where the winter had stripped the countryside bare, and he kept moving 6 miles a day, which is what 35 to 40 miles in 6 days works out to, 6 miles a day on feet that had been frostbitten 4 months earlier, carrying nothing, eating what could be bartered at farmhouse doors. While Hoerth was in the camp through that winter, things were happening in the forest west of the Schnee Eifel that deserve a place in this account. First Lieutenant Eric Fisher Wood Jr. was 25 years old in December 1944. He had graduated from Valley Forge Military Academy as valedictorian and from Princeton University in the class of 1942, was married to Margaret Wadsworth, and was the executive officer of Battery A, 589th Field Artillery Battalion, attached to the 106th Infantry Division. His son, Eric Fisher Wood III, was born on the 8th of December, 1944, 8 days before the battle, and Wood never learned about his son's birth. On December 17, Wood's convoy was ambushed by German armor on the road near Schönberg, and a high-explosive round destroyed his truck. With men around him raising their hands as German soldiers closed in from both sides of the road, Wood sprinted across an open field under fire, zigzagged through the incoming rounds, and made the tree line. Rather than walking home, Wood stayed for the next 5 weeks. He moved through the forest, gathering American stragglers, men who had slipped away from the surrender columns or been separated from their units in the confusion, and who still had weapons or had found abandoned ones, and he organized them into an ad hoc fighting unit that conducted hit-and-run attacks against German supply columns and patrol vehicles using the forest roads. Belgian civilians in the villages near Maya Road heard sustained firefights in the woods for weeks after the German offensive swept through, and they had no way to know who was fighting or why. SS General Joseph Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, reportedly described Wood and his men as criminal scoundrels and bandits, the language of a commander, embarrassed by the fact that someone was operating behind his lines with enough effectiveness to require a response. And Waffen-SS units were sent into the forest to hunt them. Wood's body was found in late January 1945, frozen on a hillside outside Maya Road, with 7 dead German soldiers around him, and over the weeks that followed, Graves registration units working that stretch of the Ardennes recovered approximately 200 dead Germans from the same forest. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Belgian Croix de Guerre. A proposal to award him the Medal of Honor was introduced in Congress in July 2020, and the proposal has not yet resulted in an award because no surviving American witnesses to his individual actions have been identified. His name is inscribed at the American Cemetery in Henri-Chapelle, Belgium. Wood's story and Hoerth's story share a single decision point: December 17 to 19, 1000, 944, when the choice was either to surrender or to refuse to surrender. Wood refused and stayed, while Hoerth refused and walked. And the two decisions produced completely different outcomes in the immediate term, while coming from the same source: an accurate assessment of what surrender meant, and a refusal to accept that assessment. The men who surrendered at the Schnee Eifel were marched east, with German guards driving columns of American prisoners down roads still jammed with the westward advance of the German offensive. Prisoners walking east, while tanks moved west on the same road through the same December cold. The march was hard. Men who fell behind were in danger, the wounded had no medical care, and German guards were inconsistent in their treatment. Some were older men, rear area troops without particular hostility who understood the war was moving toward its end, while others were SS or younger enlisted men who treated the prisoners with contempt. And the difference between which type of guard you drew on a given day was luck and nothing else. The prisoners ended up in stalags spread across Germany. Stalag 9B at Bad Orb, Stalag the 12A at Limburg an der Lahn, Stalag 4B at Mühlberg on the Elbe, and Stalag 2B at Hammerstein in Pomerania, far enough east that the eventual liberation would come from the Soviet side. The conditions at Bad Orb became particularly severe for enlisted men who received rations that were documentably insufficient to maintain health, heating that was inadequate for the temperatures, and medical care that was effectively unavailable for anything beyond the most basic treatment. Sergeant Major Bruce Fisher, who was held at Bad Orb and later co-authored the memoir Foals alongside Hoerth and Mason, described the camp as a systematic experience of deprivation, not dramatic violence for the most part, but the sustained grinding effect of cold, hunger, and enforced passivity on men who had been trained to act. The weight loss was continuous, with 40 pounds for Hoerth and comparable losses for most of the men around him, and by February, men who had been healthy infantrymen in December looked like different people. The camp held, among its population, a cross-section of men from the 106th and from other units overrun in the Bulge's first week, including men from the 28th Infantry Division's 110th Infantry Regiment, which had been nearly destroyed holding the road through Clairvaux long enough to slow the German advance south of the Schnee Eifel. Men from artillery units, service units, headquarters companies, and combat engineer battalions all ended up in the same barracks, and what they shared after months in the camp was an accurate knowledge of exactly how much they had lost and exactly how far they had to go to get it back. The congressional record entry from 1999, which formally recognized the 106th Infantry Division Association with the Congressional Gold Medal, contains a sentence that does a great deal of work in very few words. It states that the division was committed to the line under conditions no division could have survived intact. That sentence represents a half-century of historical revision, because in the immediate aftermath of the Bulge, the 106th's catastrophic losses were sometimes discussed in terms that implied a failure of fighting quality that the division had broken when veteran troops might have held. But this assessment was wrong, and was recognized as wrong within a few years of the war's end by military historians who had access to the full operational picture. What the 106th faced was not a test of fighting quality, but a mathematical problem with no solution. A 21-mile front held by approximately 8,000 infantry with 3 days in place, attacked by an offensive involving 200,000 men and 600 armored vehicles, with the equation having one outcome: John S. D. Eisenhower, whose 1,969 history, The Bitter Woods, is still considered one of the most thorough operational accounts of the Bulge, concluded that the 106th's destruction resulted primarily from placement decisions and intelligence failures above the division level. The division was put in the wrong position at the wrong time, with the wrong density of forces and insufficient warning of what was coming. James McGillis, who fought near the 106th with the 82nd Airborne Division during the Bulge, and later became one of the most decorated paratroopers in American history, wrote that the men of the 106th were sacrificed by command decisions beyond their control, and that judgment comes from a man who was there. The Congressional Gold Medal arrived 55 years late. To understand what 35 to 40 miles on foot through occupied Germany in 6 days actually required from Joseph Hoerth, the physiology matters. By late March 1945, Hoerth had been surviving on inadequate rations for approximately 3 months. Men at that level of caloric deficit lose not only fat but muscle mass, as the body begins consuming muscle tissue when fat reserves are exhausted, and strength decreases while endurance decreases faster, and the ability to maintain core body temperature under cold conditions decreases because the insulating layer is gone, and the fuel that generates heat is in short supply. His feet had been frostbitten in December, and frostbite causes permanent damage to the small blood vessels in the affected tissue, meaning that even after healing, the damaged areas are more susceptible to cold, slower to warm, and prone to pain under load. Walking 35 to 40 miles on feet with this kind of prior damage was not comfortable in the ordinary sense of the word. It was a specific and sustained ordeal that had to be managed hour by hour. The choice on December 19 mattered, and the walk in March and April mattered, but the 4 months in between mattered in the same way that an engine block matters to a car not visible in the finished picture, but the thing everything else runs on. Between December 16 and the 25th of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge produced approximately 80,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The 106th Infantry Division lost approximately 8,663 men in its first week at the front. Of the 7,000 to 8,000 men surrounded at the Schnee Eifel, somewhere between 70 and 150 reached American lines by their own action, and that last number is a range wide enough to contain significant uncertainty. The congressional record puts the number from the 422nd Infantry alone at approximately 150 who escaped to safety, while other accounts put the combined figure from both regiments as low as 70, with the discrepancy existing because there was no systematic record kept of men who refused to surrender. Some walked out in December, some walked out in April like Hoerth, and some were never accounted for. The men who walked in December faced colder weather, a more active German front, and more chaotic conditions. But they were walking toward American lines that were still relatively close before the German advance had pushed the front west to the Meuse River. The men who waited and escaped from the camps in March and April walked farther because the front had moved east toward them, but they walked through a German administrative structure that was dissolving faster than it could reorganize, and both paths were possible while neither was safe. The decision framed in the title of this video as the one decision that got him home is accurate in the sense that on the 19th of December, 1944, when Colonel Deschenaux's order reached the men of the 422nd Infantry, each soldier faced a binary comply or don't, and Hoerth didn't. And that single specific, irreversible choice set everything else in motion. But the decision that actually got him home played out over 6 days in late March and early April, 1945. The decision to go over the wire at Bad Orb when the timing was right, rather than earlier when it would have been suicidal, or later when the opportunity might have passed. The decision to travel with Mason, Fisher, and Edwards rather than alone. The decision to move at night and hide by day rather than covering ground as fast as possible, the decision to trade for food rather than going without it, and the decision on Easter Sunday to read the situation accurately enough when a German soldier held them to walk away from it. None of those individual choices was the one decision taken together. They were the cumulative product of 4 months of maintaining judgment under conditions designed to erode it. And that is the part of the story that doesn't fit in a title, but is also the part most worth understanding. Hoerth and his companions spent approximately 30 days in medical recovery after reaching American lines. With the Army's standard protocol for repatriated prisoners in this condition, involving gradual caloric refeeding, because you can't simply give a man who has been starving for months all the food he wants without causing additional problems. Weight came back slowly, and the feet required extended treatment. He eventually went home and settled in Westport Island, Maine, a small island community connected to the mainland by a short bridge on the western shore of the Sheepscot River. And he married and built a life, and for decades, like most men of his generation who had been in the camps, he said almost nothing about it. This silence is often described as stoicism, and sometimes it was, but it was also something more specific to men who had been in the stalags. They had not experienced combat glory, they had not fought at Bastogne or crossed the Rhine, and they had been captured, which carried with it a social weight that was difficult to articulate and often impossible to escape entirely. The men who had been in the camps came home to a country that honored its combat veterans and was not quite sure what to do with its prisoners of war. Treating the POW experience as an interruption of the war story rather than part of it, and for the men who had lived it, this was not an accurate description, but it was very hard to argue against. Hoerth eventually co-wrote a memoir with John Mason and Bruce Fisher, titled Foals, Friends of Long Standing, and the 4 men who had walked 35 to 40 miles together through occupied Germany in April. 1,945 remained connected to each other for the rest of their lives. The title says where the experience landed for them, not a story about survival or courage or military service, but a story about friendship and what it means to be seen by another person when everything else has been stripped away. Senator Angus King of Maine formally presented Hoerth with his Bronze Star, his Prisoner of War Medal, and his Combat Infantry Badge in a ceremony that took place when Hoerth was in his 80s. The decorations were more than 60 years late, and the Bronze Star citation could record the fact of his service under extreme hardship, but it could not record the walk, and it could not record the Easter Sunday afternoon when the German soldier held them and then didn't, and it could not record what it cost to keep moving through 6 days in a collapsing war zone, when every reasonable argument said stopping was the sensible choice. In the American cemetery at Henri-Chapelle, Belgium, Eric Fisher Wood Jr. C name is on the wall. He was 25 years old. His son was born 8 days before the battle, and he never knew. The 106th Infantry Division's history is held in the National Archives, in the regimental records of the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, in the after-action reports of the 8th Corps, and in the post-war accounts of every man who was there and later decided to write it down. The Congressional Gold Medal awarded in 1999 sits in the records of the 106th Infantry Division Association. The walk Joseph Hoerth took from Bad Orb to the American lines in April 1945 is in a memoir called Foals, Friends of Long Standing that most people have never heard of, and somewhere in that walk, past the German farmhouses where he traded soap for bread, past the Easter Sunday encounter that almost ended it, through the forested hills of the Spessart in the early spring of 1945, he covered the ground that the war had placed between him and everything he was going home to. On the 3rd of April 1945, he walked into a town that Americans had liberated the night before, and he was still walking.